Hello, everyone. Even though I hardly see you, but we'll go with the flow. I was actually very excited to see how many would like to join the session about Kubernetes in a developer-centric conference. So I'm very excited to see quite a few faces here today. So thanks for finding the time to join. I hope that some of the learnings that we and myself in different projects and in discussions with different teams, those learnings we have done the hard way, I hope that some of them can help you if you in your project, in your organization at some point decide to adopt or are already on this journey of adopting Azure Kubernetes Service. Or many of these learnings can actually be applicable to any other managed Kubernetes service or even a bare metal Kubernetes service if you prefer to go more hardcore. So I will not use that much time to talk about myself because that's not why we are here. But if you would like to know a bit more about me, you can check out christhecodingunicorn.com, which is my tech blog where I share some information about Kubernetes as well. And if you would like to also listen to the discussions on Kubernetes-related topics with different professionals in the industry, you are very much welcome to check out the Kubernetes Unpacked podcast, which I am a co-host at together with Michael Levan. So, I have been working with Kubernetes more or less since 2019, 2018, and have been focusing a lot on Azure Kubernetes Service specifically, which is a Microsoft offering of a managed Kubernetes service. And I have been in a project where we also had to abort rollout to production because many of the learnings that we had done the hard way kind of came out a bit more challenging than we expected when the time came on actually getting it rolled out in a production setting. And since then, I have also been talking with different teams in other organizations. And it was interesting to see that we were not the only ones experiencing the challenges with Kubernetes and managed Kubernetes service. And I still feel that we don't talk that much about the day zero, when you actually decide to embark on that journey, understanding what it actually means to adopt a Kubernetes service on cloud. I think it is worth sharing the stories from that journey so that maybe it will make it easier and less painful for you than it did for some other teams. And when we think about Kubernetes in cloud, we may think that maybe it's easy. So there are some questions that can pop up. Isn't that something that Microsoft fully would take responsibility for in case of AKS? Can't we just write some YAML files and just run a deploy and then everything is up and running and there is not much to think about? Then we are good. Or I, myself, in my organization, in my R&D team, am the only one who knows Kubernetes. I like it, I think it's fun, isn't that enough? And isn't that an operations problem once we delivered our Kubernetes clusters over to them and then they're good to go? Well, in many cases the answer is no, because in reality it is not that easy as it may seem. The hard fact is that AKS is not a platform as a service offering, and you can also find this statement in the Microsoft documentation. Yes, Microsoft does help you in a way that they manage the backend of the Kubernetes clusters, which is the control plane. But when it comes to the worker nodes or the VMs that you will be running your applications on, it is still your responsibility. And when we think about cloud, we should always remember about shared responsibility model. It is not given that the cloud provider would take a full responsibility for the Kubernetes clusters, in this case, for their security, for the proper hardening, for the proper configuration. Many of these things you would need to think about as a consumer of the managed Kubernetes service. And there are a lot of discussions these days about Kubernetes being hard, and there are many experts out there that are like saying that, but no, it is not hard. You just read the documentation and you're good. But I would like to say that yes, it may not be hard to learn, but you would need to have time and patience, even in terms of a Kubernetes service in cloud. And therefore, when you decide to adopt AKS, it is really worth investing into the day zero phase of this adoption. We hear a lot about day two, which is operations. We hear a lot about day one, when you are working on kind of doing the work of getting those clusters ready for production. But day zero, understanding the scope and the overall picture of what you need to take responsibility for and put in place to make it production ready will take time, and that's worth to invest in because it will pay off. And the approach is layered, like in many cases. There are multiple layers that you need to think about in order to prepare for production. So if we go more into some concrete stages, there is a lot to it, especially if you open a documentation. There is like thousands of different articles covering all the different layers, and it can become very overwhelming. But today I would like to share a few highlights, a few areas that we and other teams have found to be most critical and most important to think about. So let's break it down. The first one is the applications, and many of you may be developers here today, so I hope some of these learnings could be useful for you. But there will also be other aspects that you can, as a developer, also take further and have in the back of your head when you are working with your applications that will be rolled out to Kubernetes, to AKS, so that you can also have that informative dialogue with other roles in your R&D department. But applications is where it all starts. We can create as good and secure and hardened and optimized Kubernetes AKS clusters. I will be using AKS and Kubernetes terms interchangeably. But we can create our AKS clusters as good as we can. But if we have applications that are not ready to be rolled out in Kubernetes, then we will not come a long way. If we take a look at some interesting success stories that have been shared by different companies when they used their legacy applications and they migrated them to AKS. One of these examples is Forza Horizon 5, which is a racing game that some of you may have played. They have shared a story of their services that have been running on .NET Framework, initially on premises. And then at some point they migrated them to Azure Virtual Machines first, but when they saw the need to scale up to 1 million concurrent users, that's when they saw that AKS could be the savior in this case. And what they did is that they migrated those .NET Framework services to AKS and have been running those on Windows. And they succeeded with it a lot, so much that the Microsoft boss, Satya Nadella, also shared about this publicly as a great success story. But if we look into the details of that story, we will see that they had 16 microservices, which means that the applications were lightweight, even though they were running on .NET Framework, which made it possible for them to actually do the lift and shift and scale at the same time efficiently. Another example is a pet care company called VCA, which is part of the Mars Pets veterinary company, one of the largest ones in the US, that is behind, for instance, if you have dogs or cats, you have probably heard about Pedigree or Whiskas. So this company is behind producing those. And they also had an application that was built upon Windows Presentation Foundation, and they needed to extend it in order to support additional functionality, like a referral system that could connect pet owners, medical professionals, and the staff in this organization. And if they were to extend that legacy application, that would have taken months. And Kubernetes and AKS was out of the question then, because the scalability would still be the problem. So what they did is that they started refactoring that application, and they started to build services outside of it so that they will be scalable enough in order to run on AKS. And that's when they also succeeded and successfully migrated and have been able to scale and run the new services efficiently. So the whole point that kind of goes through these stories once you start looking into the details is that lift and shift the application the way it is to AKS would not necessarily fix all the problems. And one important thing to think about here is the size of the containerized application when that will be running in AKS. If we take an example of an ASP.NET Framework base image with .NET Framework 4.8 installed, the base image itself is 3 to 4 gigs in size, depending on what kind of Windows server OS is powering it. But then on top of that, you have all the security patches and updates that can also come with a few gigs in size. And then you have the application itself. I have seen applications that have been containerized that are 13, 14 gigs in size. If you think about that container image that will need to be pulled on a new virtual machine, it will take some time. If it is a legacy application that requires a lot of warm-up actions, it also takes time. And then when you are there and need to scale fast, and you end up in using 10, 15 minutes to actually being able to download that container image and to make it ready to accept traffic, then you are not solving the problem there and then, because that may be too late when the application becomes ready. So thinking about how you can make your applications more lightweight, how you can make them more ready to be able to scale fast, how you can reduce the warm-up time is definitely the step one of this journey. And you should also think about the overall roadmap of where you're heading. Are you only working with Microsoft Azure? Or do you have a multi-cloud strategy? Do you have some workloads running on premises? We have a lot of managed add-ons, managed services that you could install on top of AKS. But if you have other cloud platform, for instance, that you may use, then you may not necessarily want to think about adopting a managed service and integrating it in an AKS cluster. So you would need to evaluate, do you have the competence to maintain a separate service in a cluster yourself, or can you use a managed service that AKS can provide you to make it easier to maintain and operate? So these are the things that you would need to evaluate in terms of application, and see if you would need to refactor it and prepare it a bit more before you actually start rolling it out on AKS. And once we move from applications, we also need to account for the human factor, because we are not alone there that will be taking this decision, that will be adopting Kubernetes clusters. And back in 2018, there was actually someone putting the trend out there about Kubernetes may not be the right thing for you. But today is not the case when I can say, well, the day zero considerations is that you don't need AKS, so we are done. This will not be the case today. But a lot of conversations going on these days are about taking informative decisions and understanding, for your use case, will actually AKS be the best solution? Because it will require quite a lot, both from the developers, but also from operations and from the whole R&D and potentially the whole organization. So understanding if AKS is the right choice for you, or maybe a serverless solution like Azure Container Apps, is something that is worth thinking about when you are evaluating if AKS is the way to go. And probably going for the reason that we should do Kubernetes or we should do AKS because Spotify does it or any other cool company does it is not the best reason to opt in on that journey. And the Kubernetes is one of the platform providers for multi-cloud Kubernetes offering. They have said that Kubernetes management requires making cultural shifts on steroids, and that is definitely true. So apart from thinking if this would bring value to you and your everyday and to your customers, you also need to ensure that you actually collaborate with others who will be involved in this journey. For example, if you have not only the cloud offering, but you have a product that you deliver for on-premises customers, just deciding to move to AKS or deciding to port your application to Linux, if it has been running on Windows for many years, is not done in a day. If you have operations resources that are coming from the Windows background, they need to learn Linux because you will not be able to progress without that understanding. So putting attention on that, on planning how you need to prepare others who may need to be working with those AKS clusters, maintain them, operate them, upgrade the applications in case there are breaking changes in AKS clusters that can affect them, is also part of day zero consideration. But the most important thing is to do the change for the right reasons and not follow the trend, whatever trend that may be. And now, moving from the organization as a whole, it's worth to stop and think about our dear developers, which many of you may be here since it's a developer-centric conference. So we can build awesome clusters that run very well, but we still need to think about what migration to Kubernetes and containers can actually do to developers. And if we take a look at this year's agenda, we can see that developers have enough to think about in terms of complexity in the applications themselves. And many developers may want to stay in their comfort zone and just focus on the application development. If we suddenly get back to our developers and tell them that they need to learn how to containerize applications, how to write deployment templates for AKS in order to deploy those applications there, you suddenly create a lot of complexity and things that developers would need to remember. So another point that is worth considering is how, as part of this journey, we could simplify it for developers to adopt as well. And here is one example that has been taken from one of the clusters, one of the AKS clusters we had, even though it's blurred. The point here is that we did not have any checks that could actually protect developers from configuring their applications on AKS clusters in the wrong way. And what happened here is that a few applications did not have any CPU or memory limits on them. And those applications had some bugs in them, which ended up in those apps taking all the resources that were available on those nodes, on those VMs, taking down all the other healthy applications, and not being able to start themselves. So all of these are the failed attempts to start any of the applications. So they have statuses like evicted, restarted, crash loop, back off. If you have worked with Kubernetes before, these are some of the scary statuses you don't want to see yourself. So when we are building those platforms, even though it is in cloud, we still need to think about how we can simplify and abstract that complexity away from developers, but at the same time create validations and checks that can actually help protect developers from deploying or something in those clusters that may be configured improperly. And it's not given that you may have resources to build all those cool internal developer platforms with a lot of cool UI and a lot of functionality that is happening automatically, but there are other alternatives that you could do. If you already have existing automation in place, you may extend that by helping developers generate some of those best practices as part of the new application deployment templates that they're working on. You could have some blueprints that developers can just click and deploy and just adjust the configuration. .NET templates, .NET custom templates can be one of the possibilities. There are also other tools that we have now that we didn't have back in 2019, like, for instance, Draft is a tool that will generate the Docker file for your container, application container, and even the deployment templates to deploy that application to AKS. And there is GitHub Copilot these days, when we are talking a lot about AI, that can also help you with kind of generating and getting assistance on creating the necessary files to be able to get that application up and running on AKS. And there are a few links that I will share afterwards where those tools are a part of it, so do check it out if that is interesting. And what we have seen brought a lot of value is having the hands-on workshops, not just providing the theory, but having that hands-on workshops and live walkthroughs with a concrete scenario of deploying an application to an AKS cluster, seeing the whole workflow, taking a look, maybe even failing and figuring out what the failure is something that provided the most learning for the resources that had to learn how to do this. And of course, having those automated checks that could help you to start following those best practices from the start, like Azure Policy is a very powerful tool also in context of Kubernetes and AKS specifically. And if we get time to take a look at it, I will show you how it can really help you to protect yourself from improper configurations. Another point, when we have talked a bit about the human factor and developing the applications themselves that are ready for AKS, I would like to mention about how you would actually deploy those applications and what are the best practices there. And some of you may have heard about a term that is called GitOps. And Shakespeare may once have said, to GitOps or not, that is the question. And if you go to KubeCon, for instance, which I was at in April, you would hear that, yes, GitOps is the golden standard. If you don't do GitOps, you get a boo. But I actually want to be a bit critical here, and I say, yes, GitOps is definitely the golden standard because it can help you really deploy efficiently, deploy frequently. You have your repositories in Git that are the single source of truth. And once you add a change to your application, it's deployed instantly to an AKS cluster. But once you adopt this, if you still don't have the proper mindset, if you don't have the proper development processes with the high level of automation, with the high level of automatic and efficient tests of different types, if you don't have the proper security controls in place that will ensure and prevent any insecure configurations being merged, if your operations team or whoever will be maintaining those clusters don't have the competence to maintain those GitOps tools, then you can end up in a very difficult situation. And during KubeCon, which is one of the biggest conferences about Kubernetes, there was an interesting session about GitOps and how it changed people's lives. And even there were people who were sharing their stories, how they adopted GitOps, but they didn't prepare well enough, and they had hundreds of projects, and they struggled. But they have come such a long way that was kind of creating a lot of difficulties, and they were considering rolling back, which means that, again, GitOps is a trend and is the best practice, but you would need to be prepared for it in order to succeed with it. So the point is that you can always start simpler and mature over time. And once you feel that you have gained the necessary skills, you could always integrate processes and tools that are related to GitOps. Another point that also can come unexpectedly is cost. And sustainability is also a topic that is highly related to it. I have a question for you. Just out of your head, how much resources in percentage, how much compute capacity is underutilized in Kubernetes clusters? Just throw me a percent.
97.
How much?
97.
97? Interesting. 7? 70. That's not that bad, actually. But there was a report done by one of the cost optimization tool providers, and they have discovered that more than 37% of compute capacity in Kubernetes is underutilized, which means that those are just resources that are there but are not actually used. This does not only mean that you have a higher emissions impact, but you also have all that cost ticking in. And what they have been looking into with their customers, where they have identified that, the Cast AI, the company behind this report, they were able to reduce, by reducing that amount of unused resources, save hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of those companies that have like a large scale Kubernetes clusters. So thinking about how you can utilize the resources in the most efficient manner, how you can adjust your applications in order to use less resources, in order to be more performant, can help you go a long way also in terms of cost reduction. But at the same time, you can also optimize your resources and use less. And by saving cost, you may invest it other places that can make your AKS clusters even more sustainable. So a few things you can think about as part of planning how your AKS clusters and applications will look like is what kind of VMs you actually need to run on for those applications. How much CPU and memory would they need? What kind of regions you need to deploy them in, because it has both the price aspect but also the emissions aspect there. Using the event-driven scaling will allow you also to not scale based on your assumptions, but actually adapt the scaling of the application to exactly the endpoints and the functionality in the application that will give you most useful information in terms of when it makes sense to scale, which means that you would have less underutilized resources and scale much more efficiently. But also put in the limit on how many instances you want to scale to. In case you have a performance bug in an app, which I have experienced myself, it can actually cause an unpredictable scaling. And by default in AKS, for instance, you have 100 instances you can scale to. 100 nodes, 100 VMs. If you have a bug, then you can pay quite a lot of money potentially and have a lot of resources that are just wasted away due to that. But you can actually configure a limit which also will prevent cases like this from happening. And once again, Azure policy can help you a lot on this journey. And also cost management tools. Like Azure has invested into developing OpenCost, which is an open source solution, further, and to kind of make it give you as much useful information as possible in terms how much do your AKS clusters actually cost. Have you heard about scream test? I need to put it out there because I really like that term. Do you know what that is? Anyone? That's when you remove a service and you wait until someone screams. And if someone screams, you bring that back up again. But if no one screams, that means that that service was actually never used. And this brings me to the point of dugnad, which we have in Norway. It's when everyone tries to hide from it, but it actually has a good reason behind it. When you go out once a year, clean all the surroundings around your house, make it nice and pretty, reduce waste that is just lying there. The same thing would be with AKS clusters. If you have playground clusters where you are like testing out your applications, if you don't need them, you would need to have a process to ensure that those are removed. And by that, once again, you reduce the cost and you reduce the impact on our environment, on our planet. And tools like KubeCost, OpenCost can actually help you with that by flagging the resources that haven't been used or haven't received any requests. That will also help you make more informed decisions. And this is one of the examples from a tool called Cloud Carbon Footprint. Here it shows the emission intensity of the different Azure regions. And if we can take a look here, Norway East and Norway West are kind of on the low intensity level. But if you take a look at those that are more on the right-hand side, you can see that they are of high intensity. And it takes a bunch of factors into consideration, like what kind of sources are used to generate power, if those are coal or if those are more natural resources, like, for instance, wind. If we take a look at the cost aspect, it was taken, it may not look that good in the screen, but I can just show you the screenshot from the Linux virtual machines and Windows virtual machines. And the difference in price can actually be significant. If you take a look at the family on the first one with 2 virtual CPUs and 8 RAM, you could see that for Linux it's $78, while for Windows it's $145. So of course, considering if your application would make sense to migrate to Linux, to be able to run it on Linux could be a consideration from the cost perspective, from the size perspective of your final container image. Yeah, it can help you potentially run your applications efficiently. And when it comes to the region, the price also comes into the consideration. Here there are the numbers from 2022, from last year. North Europe on the top has 289 kroners versus West Europe with 308 and versus Norway East with 339 kroners per month for B2S virtual machine. And in 2023, we also know that due to the economical situation and global political situation, the prices have also increased in cloud. And those same machines are now cost more. So once again, in North Europe, it costs 321 kroners from 289. In West Europe, it's 342 from 308. And finally, in Norway, it's 377 kroners from 339. It may not be a big price for 1 month, but monitoring and looking into which regions you can choose from, of course, thinking about the privacy aspect as well, which ones you can choose from, is definitely worth looking into. And these are screenshots from KubeCost, which can help you analyze the usage of your clusters, provide you information about how efficient the cluster is. As you can see, this cluster is not very efficient, with 7% of actual usage. And it can provide you recommendations on what you can do to reduce the cost of the clusters, both by right-sizing, but also by managing underutilized workloads. And it can calculate approximate savings for you. So looking into the cost management tool as part of that journey can definitely bring a lot of value, which will make your bosses more happy as well. And the last point that I would like to talk about is security, which is one of the most underestimated areas of Kubernetes and AKS, because many think that it was created secure by default, but it's a trap, because it wasn't, and security was never kind of part of the initial design. It was not designed for security. This is something that was expected that the consumers would work into implementing, but Kubernetes was designed with efficiency, for scaling, for easier adoption in case of cloud, for instance. So thinking about the security controls can make a lot of sense as well. And one more question I have for you is, what do you think these numbers represent?
0 days.
What?
0 days?
0 days? No. Any other suggestions? Yeah, yes, right on top there. These are the amount of clusters worldwide, both running on premises but also running in cloud, that have their Kubernetes API servers, which is the middleman between the client and the backend of the Kubernetes, exposed to the internet. So it means you can get a response. You can't necessarily actually get a response with data, but you get response like unauthenticated or unauthorized. And this means that you have a bunch of additional attack surface that is just out there for attackers to enjoy and play around with. And who knows, maybe there is a misconfiguration on that cluster that will actually allow attackers to move further into the cluster. And there is a company called Shadow Server, and they have their portal available where they display results on a daily basis from their scans worldwide, where you can actually go and check how many clusters have been detected as publicly exposed in terms of last week or last month. So this can be a very interesting thing to look into after the session. The link will be provided in the resources afterwards. And in terms of AKS, by default, if you do not configure any IP ranges or configure it as a private cluster, the API server will be public. So you will actually be able to call it and get a response. And this is something that you don't necessarily know if you don't check all the documentation in detail, and something we have learned the hard way. And once again, when you think about security, the layered approach comes here as well. If it's not only about securing the clusters, but it's also about securing the infrastructure that the clusters run on in Azure, that you have responsibility to look into. Not all of it, but some parts of it may be your responsibility. Also securing the container that your application runs in, and also securing the application itself, because if the application is not secure, it is not given that all the other protection controls will actually be enough to mitigate a potential backdoor or a security hole that attackers could use. And when we think about containers that we want to package our applications into, it's not always given that you can get security of, for instance, base images by default. Here is an example of the ASP.NET Core image that you could use if you have a .NET Core application. And it runs with a root user with the highest level of admin privileges by default, and you can't actually just easily switch it. You would need to do some specific workarounds and do some additional coding to ensure that you actually switch to using a non-admin user. And this is due to the ports, the default ports that, for instance, Kestrel server expects. So Kestrel server typically uses port 80, and if you have ports up to 1030, I think it would require to use an admin user. So if you didn't know about that, you would have actually had containers that have an admin user, and if the attackers get into those containers, then they can actually use specific tools and processes to escape out of that container, potentially, onto the node, onto the virtual machine, and actually get access to the other applications. And there are some cool sessions out there that you can take a look into if you would like to see how this is happening. Fortunately, there are some improvements there that are coming out. So when you are considering to package your application as a container, do check out if that base image has an alternative that actually has a non-root user. And Nginx default base image uses root user, but they have a separate image called unprivileged, which uses a non-root user. And the same with .NET Core. With .NET 8, they are releasing a configuration option that you can use to configure your application to run as non-root. So when you are working on container development, do check out how you can ensure that your application in a container will not be using a root user by default. And how you can do that. There are many buzzwords from different areas of tech these days, and you may see where I'm going with this. But DevSecOps, kind of a buzzword, but it still makes a lot of sense when we think about the layered approach of an AKS cluster or a Kubernetes cluster in general, looking into security controls in development when you get that application and deploy it on the cluster, and also when it's running in the cluster itself, kind of wrapping that security around all the stages of software development will help you get there and have a properly secured application and AKS clusters. And once again, Azure Policy can be a really powerful tool that can help you do it properly from the start. And there are a bunch of frameworks out there that your customers potentially may require. What I learned the hard way is that it can go quite fast once you start adopting AKS, containers, and suddenly you have a service or two that are already running out there on an AKS cluster in production. And then you have some curious customers that may get back to you and say, yeah, we're using your cluster and we're using your service that we know is running on Kubernetes, on AKS. So are you compliant with OWASP Top 10 for Kubernetes? Are you compliant with OWASP Top 10 for containers? And can you provide proof for that? And when you kind of get back to it and start scratching your head and thinking, are we actually compliant? Then it can be a lot of work to do that refactoring to become compliant. And not all of it can be done without rebuilding the clusters, without refactoring the application to actually be able to run with the new security settings. So AKS does have a security baseline, both for the Linux images, if you have applications that can run on those, and for the AKS clusters themselves. So this is definitely worth checking out during the planning journey, and start with that as early as possible. And I would like to show a quick demo, and maybe we will have enough time to take the last point afterwards that I have. What I would like to show you first of all is the AKS cluster that I have in the portal. And as I mentioned, the API server is exposed by default. So I just want to show you what happens once we try to call it. So here we have the API server address. So if we just use that one and open a private window, let's see, and then just paste it in. Oops, sorry. I need to use HTTP. No, that's how it is with the demo gods. Let's see if we can. Okay. All right. No, let's see. All right. Okay, that may be some troubles with the network I have. Will you trust me if I say that it worked on my machine? But what you will get there, it worked on my machine before, I promise. I don't know what's happening in here. Okay.
But the cluster is running.
Yes, it is running. So I tested it earlier today. As you can see, it succeeded in running. And typically, when I need to show it, I get. Let's see if we. Right. Oh, yeah. Let's take a. No. Oops. Then I may have a problem with maybe Microsoft is down. Maybe I can say that this is the reason. Let's see if I have at least connection to the cluster. No, okay. Then we have a problem. Then I can't actually show you the connection because it worked right before this session. So let's see if I can take the last point and we'll try get back to it, and maybe the demo gods will show some mercy and I will actually show you some of the demos that I wanted to show. All right, we'll get back to that. The last point that I wanted to talk about I am getting really sweaty in here. All right, the last point is precisely what may happen once you actually need to start using it, for instance, in production. And that is the story of day 2 operations. When you have everything worked nicely in dev, everything worked nicely in pre-production, and then the day comes and operations take over, or maybe you are still responsible for that, but then your customers come in the morning and start using it. And what may happen? Things may fail, and things will fail at one point or another. Some examples, and even though I am taking examples from Microsoft Azure specifically, if you do a quick search, you will see that every cloud provider has experienced some kind of outages, which shows us that cloud providers are not perfectly available at any single point in time. So you would need to ensure that you have a proper disaster recovery plan in case things happen. So one of the examples that happened in August last year was when there was a faulty update that was pushed to Linux OS, which caused a full outage of the services that have been using Linux machines, Linux OS, and AKS was the one that was affected most. And at that point, they have been using Linux for the Linux nodes, a version of 18.04, which was the one that was affected. And if you were to fix it, you actually needed to do a restart. But this is something that took time for people to figure out, or actually reach out to Microsoft to get some information. It was a few hours. I think for some it even took 1 to 2 days of the issues that have been happening with Linux machines. So this kind of demonstrates that errors may happen also on the vendor side. And another one, maybe many of you have experienced some nightmares about, but at least Twitter was full of a lot of information about this outage that happened in January 2023, when there was a global outage of all the services in Microsoft Azure in all regions apart from China, and also affected Microsoft 365 services, which also was related to a faulty update to wide area network, which took a few hours to fix as well. So how can you prepare to issues that may happen both with your application but also on the vendor side? First of all, thinking about the upgrade strategy of your clusters and nodes that you run your applications on is important, because at some point, if you do not upgrade frequently enough, Microsoft may stop supporting that version and actually help you. And if it poses a security risk and you are not upgrading when they ask you to, they can actually do it themselves on your behalf. And if you have many versions that you're lying behind, then you can imagine that this may potentially be really destructive. So it's worth thinking about doing that frequently. Early adoption of preview features can also cause challenges, and that's the reason for why Microsoft officially takes their responsibility out of it. If you are using preview features in production, you are on your own. So being critical about that will also be beneficial. Having the observability and a disaster recovery plan and observability to understand how your system is performing and get alerted quickly so that you could fix the issues quickly would also help you react fast when the S hits the fan. And chaos engineering is actually a very interesting aspect of that, which can help you simulate, which can help you have all those tabletop or full-scale exercises where you could simulate an outage of a specific region where you are provisioning your AKS clusters, or it can simulate a DNS issue, or it can simulate an outage of a specific virtual machine type. So that you could see how you react, how your automation is performing, and how much time it takes to get back to normal. And Azure Chaos Studio is a service that will help you perform some of really good experiments towards AKS clusters. And having production-like clusters and also playground clusters where you are allowed to fail, will also help other resources, especially operations team, to start operating from the beginning. And what I have learned the hard way is that it is really worth and valuable ensuring that those who will be there operating those clusters actually know how to do that and have that hands-on knowledge. So do not wait with involving them early. And this is how you deploy. This is how you succeed with AKS. Easy enough, isn't it? You've seen my demo. Summing it up, and then we'll try once again. A few documents that you can start with are basically the baselines, the baseline architecture, which also provides blueprints on GitHub that you can basically click and deploy to play around with, security baseline for AKS, and also the sustainability guidance on how to run your workloads and AKS clusters efficiently. Day 2 operations guide can also be really valuable. And one more page I would like to show you is the AKS the AKS checklist. This is actually a very good, useful page that you could use, because this checklist has all the best practices, and you can like create a project where you can like click and go through those pages and ensure that you have those practices implemented. So that can really like be a nice guidance that is maintained by the community using AKS. So it is updated relatively frequently. So the last one was in April, and it's split into different sections. So definitely could recommend that. And finally, what is even more important is the collaboration culture from the start, and involving those who will be part of that journey will positively benefit you. Yes, shall we try once again? If you have any questions in the meantime, just speak up, and I will try to see if I can get it up and running once again.
I was wondering one thing.
Yes?
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really inspiring with all the cat memes.
You're very much welcome.
But for example, if we have what would be the good use case for the Kubernetes, given the decoupled architecture, control ASPs, for example, as a service plan?
That's a great question. So the question was, what will be the use cases for Kubernetes? And this is something that I wanted to mention, but I forgot. So that's very good that you asked about that. And we hear a lot about like microservices, and distributed system is kind of the use case for Kubernetes. So if you have a lot of microservices, that's when you should adopt it. I would say that is not always the case, because if you have, like in some of those success stories, they had 5 to 6 microservices, but they needed to scale to hundreds and hundreds of instances. So the amount of microservices is not necessarily the only factor. It is the scaling. How much do you need to scale, and how fast do you need to scale? That may be the reason for why you would adopt AKS, because it can provide you that speed and that kind of possibility to scale into many instances. So you may have few microservices and still scale. You also may have a monolithic application. I know of companies or projects that have monolithic applications that are running in containers, in AKS, or in other Kubernetes clusters, but they are lightweight. They do not, the containers are not that big, and the warm-up time is very limited. So you could have a monolithic application. You may have your database or other services that it needs to connect to running outside of the cluster that it would connect to. And you will still be able to succeed with it. But if you have a very heavy application, then I have learned it really, really hard way. So I would warmly not recommend that, and would recommend to like see how you could reduce the size of the app. And a few other use cases are machine learning. Typically, if you have like machine learning models that also need to scale, that you would use for training and kind of making it available, like the GPT language model, it is running on AKS. So there are some cool articles there about the infrastructure behind it. And also batch processing is also often a use case where you have like a large amount of jobs that may be processing large batches at different points in time. You could also use AKS. And you will need to look into the size, right, and the overhead. Like, do you have enough knowledge to maintain it? You can have one cluster, you can have 2 clusters, but you just need to ensure that that would make more sense than just running serverless, which will require less knowledge or less advanced competence from you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The last
Yes?
you mentioned that when it comes to scalability, AKS is quite a good thing. But you also mentioned the databases, which means stateful or stateless period of the applications. When you said that if you have an application that will scale to 500 instances or something, all of them are stateless, right?
Yes.
They need to report back the state of or the outcome of the computations to some sort of database of stuff. So that still needs to be taken into consideration whilst you trying to adopt AKS as your mantra.
Yes, obviously. So the question was like, if you have applications that are dependent on services like database, you have some state, you have stateful applications that need to maintain that state, especially when it has a lot of instances that are up and running on an AKS on Kubernetes. And the main point is that your applications should be developed stateless when they are running in Kubernetes. So they must not be dependent on the state that is stored on that specific container or that specific pod where the application is running, because pods are ephemeral, so they can die whenever, and then you lose that local state. So you need to ensure that your application is actually refactored for that use case, and that you actually can store that state elsewhere. Or if it is an application that is stateful, there are some capabilities in Kubernetes that can help you ensure that even if you have multiple instances, they are connected to the same like volume. Typically you have a volume mount that you mount to a specific node or based on specific like application label or whatever. And then once a pod dies or a new instance is spawn up on another node, it will still kind of use the same volume, so you could ensure that that state is preserved there as well. You're welcome. 3 minutes. This sounds like a very disastrous approach for me to try out. But if you would like to take a look at those demos, I also have both the step-by-step guides in the GitHub repo, and if you would like to check out that session in other events, you maybe will get to see those demos. So I'm sorry that this didn't work. I can blame Microsoft. Does someone have access to Azure Portal? I'm just curious. So sorry about that. Better luck next time with the demo. This was not my day, obviously, but this QR code will take you to the GitHub repo with all the demos and where you could test them out. If you would like to connect with me, talk about it in more detail, you're very much welcome to do that. And there are also some resources to read further about it. So thank you so much. I'm sorry.